I'm going to introduce Lou Wheatcraft, who's going to give us a presentation on standards and regulations compliance. Lou, take it away, please.
This presentation is an outgrowth of a discussion that took place on our Yammer site over the last several months. And it was obvious that this is an issue to a lot of organizations. It has been for as long as I can remember. And so I thought I would give this presentation. Everything that I'm going to talk about is actually from the Needs and Requirements Manual. Some of it was in section 4 on driver's constraints and the lifecycle analysis maturation needs definition part, section 6 on requirements definition, and then section 10 on verification validation. So detailed text, you can go to the manual and read that. Contents wise, there's a lot involved. We talk about driver's constraints and how regulations and standards are part of the driver's constraint identification, develop lifecycle concepts concerning how you're going to comply with the standards and regulations, define needs, transforming those into design input requirements. We have to be thinking ahead to system verification validation. We have to document the evidence of compliance. And it's this evidence of compliance that our approval is going to be based on. Driver constraints, things outside the project's control that constrain or drive our solution space. Compliance is mandatory, and failing to show compliance will result in the system failing system validation, qualification, certification, acceptance, and approval for use. Driver's constraints can represent a major source of needs and requirements that drive and constrain the lifecycle concepts analysis and maturation activities, as well as the solution space available to the design team. The thing about standards and regulations is that they are a major source of driver's constraints, and they can show a substantial portion of product development activities, cost and schedule. And so it's very important because of this that we spend time up front on standards and regulations and figuring out how we're going to show compliance with it, how we're going to document the evidence that does show that, how we're going to present that information. Because it's not just a matter of saying we're going to be compliant. We have to verify the system of interest to show compliance for those requirements that deal with the system of interest itself. We're going to validate to show compliance with any needs that invoke relevant standards and regulations for the system of interest. And then organizations must show evidence that they've developed the system of interest per the relevant standards and regulations. And so organizations may define internal organizational standards based on lessons learned, best practices to ensure quality products. So you not only have the external standards to deal with, but projects will often have internal standards developed by their enterprise as well that they have to deal with. And standards and regulations contain requirements related to regulatory compliance. For example, medical devices, pharmaceuticals, aviation, ground transportation, consumer products. There's standards and regulations concerning safety, security, resilience, addressing prevention from harm, loss, misuse, and recovery from that loss, production processes, parts, workmanship, how you're actually going to build the system, there's standards for that, development, risk, and management processes, configuration management, project management, system engineering standards. 15288 is a standard on how we do systems engineering. Our system engineering handbooks are actually standards in how we do system engineering. There's medical devices, there's regulations that outline the processes that are to be used to develop medical devices and pharmaceuticals. The same for transportation. NASA has their own set of procedural requirements and directives for space systems. The FAA is developing the same for the commercial space. Some standards deal with design approaches of certain types of systems. For example, petroleum extraction, distribution, processing, they actually define certain design, actually have mechanical drawings showing piping and valving. And so they get down to that level of detail. And then the standards for specific methods for test, verification, validation, acceptance, certification, qualification that have to be followed. And then there's standards for compatibility and interoperability, interaction between systems, communication protocols, APIs, interface control documents, connectors. USB is a compatibility standard. So there's standards and regulations that apply to the process and methods used by the organization to develop products. And I would think that probably a majority of the standards, like ISO standards, deal with processes and methods to be used by the organization rather than on the system itself. There are standards on all levels of system architecture. Some are design inputs, some design outputs, like the design example for valves and piping, and then standards just for how you're going to show compliance. In some cases, the standards in the product are written, like I say, at the design input level, stating what needs to be done and why, but not how. The how's left up to the design, test, and manufacturing organizations. Other cases, standards and regulations address specific how for design, testing, manufacturing. In the medical device pharmaceutical world, there's regulations concerning system validation, and they're of critical importance for the approval and release for public use. You're always hearing about the clinical trials for certain classes of medical devices and pharmaceuticals. Projects must make sure that they comply to all relevant industry standards and regulations mandated by the customer and government regulatory agencies. The word relevant is highlighted because it's important that organizations only address standards and regulations and portion of those that apply to the types of products developed by the organization. I'll get into it a little bit later, but I've seen so many projects where in a document-based world, the requirements in the front is the section called applicable documents and reference documents. That list can grow to be quite large, and some projects just copy and paste that list from one project to another without ever reading or assessing whether or not any of those are actually relevant to the system of interest. And these are put into their technical requirements. And a lot of what they have in that list are actually not on the product itself, but it's on how the organization is going to produce the product. So this assessment is extremely important. A key mistake is invoking this generic list rather than doing this analysis. So the project's going to have to show compliance through system verification with each requirement invoked by standard and regulation. So you don't want to invoke things that are not relevant. You want to make sure you're invoking only those requirements within standards and regulations that are relevant to the specific system of interest that you're developing to be included in your technical requirements. And organizations then must identify all these relevant standards for each country in which a device is being marketed. So if you're developing a product you're going to market across the world, you got to look at each country you're going to market in to make sure you identify the relevant standards and regulations for each of those countries. And it's very important that you clearly write the rationale for each standard regulation, making it clear why that standard regulation is relevant. And you're also making the decision, why is the cost of compliance acceptable? Because you can't ignore the fact that there's a cost with compliance. And this is true for both the customers and to the suppliers. So if a customer is going to invoke standards, they must accept the cost for the supplier to show evidence that they've met the requirements in those standards and regulations. We have compliance stakeholders. Not all organizations do this. I can't understand why not, but I think it's really important because of the impact of not showing compliance. So organizations should have some internal compliance or quality group that's responsible for ensuring the relevant standards and regulations are identified, managed, and clearly complied with by all projects within the organization. And this group can work with each project team within the organizations throughout the development lifecycle to help ensure compliance. So they're a resource project teams can use to make sure that they are doing what they need to do to show compliance. And the compliance groups can interact with external regulatory agencies and even with the customer to make sure the intent of the standards and regulations are being met, that the objective evidence needed to show compliance through system verification, system validation is clearly defined, and concepts for how you're going to show compliance have been defined up front, that the data needed for certification, qualification, acceptance is properly recorded in approval packages. I'll talk more about that later, and submitted to the approving authority in accordance with the requirements defined by that agency. And for the customer, acceptance, what's needed should be defined in the statement of work or supplier agreement. And so this is really important when customers are outsourcing some of the work to a supplier, that they be thinking ahead to this compliance with standards and regulations. What are the activities they expect of the supplier? What are the key deliverables? and the customer has to be willing to accept the cost and the time it takes. And so different levels of within an organization, at the organizational level, the overall ConOps is defined. They identify the product line, services to be identified. And based on this, the business is going to define what the relevant standards and regulations are. And then for these standards, concepts, needs, and requirements are going to be defined. This should all be done at the business level. And then each project, the system level, then it's clear to them that for the organization, what standards and regulations apply, whether it applies to the processes that govern how they're going to develop a product, or it applies to the product itself. And so the compliance stakeholders exist at this business operations level of the organization, and they're there to support all the different projects that are delivering products within the product line. The whole reason for this presentation is understanding the consequences of failing to show compliance. And if we don't plan for this early, there's going to be a big risk of non-compliance. So we need to identify what are relevant. We need to have the concepts developed, define the needs and requirements so we can avoid this risk of non-compliance. How can a system of interest be expected to meet safety and security needs, for example, if the requirements weren't identified, lifecycle concepts developed concerning compliance and included in the system interest integrated set of needs and resulting sets of design input requirements, making sure that we have the capabilities built into our systems that avoid loss or protect from loss or allow us to recover from loss. And there needs to be functional requirements defined up front that result in those capabilities. Failing to show compliance and failed system verification, system validation is going to result in the system failing qualification, certification, approval for use, resulting in the developed system of interest being rejected. If this happens, it could be very costly and result in expensive rework, schedule slips. In some cases, it could lead to bankruptcy and loss of millions of dollars for a company. This is one problem I've seen in some startup companies. They have a brilliant idea and they want to market that, but they're not really that cognizant in all the standards and regulations involved in bringing that to market. And so they don't necessarily meet all the requirements for showing compliance, and then their product gets rejected. So we have the concept of compliance risk. And just like any risk, we need to realize that this risk exists and we need to deal with it. So failing to properly show compliance with standards and regulations is a major source of risk for a project. A report that I saw for 2017, the U.S. Federal Drug Administration conducted 17,487 audits worldwide, and they issued 5,045 letters of non-compliance. This is almost a third of the audits they did. That's not a very good percentage. So it's a real problem. Compliance risk is something that we need to really address. So to minimize compliance risk, organizations must research and understand which standards are relevant and the requirements of certification, qualification, acceptance that must be met, and the data, informed data required by the approving authorities and regulatory agencies to show compliance. To avoid compliance risk, even if not explicitly stated by the customers or other stakeholders, the organization must be aware of and research all relevant standards and regulations applicable to their product line. Again, failure to do this can result in system rejection and failed projects. And then we have this case where we're developing products for a customer. The customer is going to frequently specify standards and regulations that apply to their systems, and they should be communicated within the statement of work. The project then is going to have to derive specific needs and requirements that meet the intent of the requirements in the customer documents, and they have to provide evidence through system verification and validation that they're compliant to the customer's standards and regulations. And this compliance will be part of the customer's regulatory qualification acceptance activities. Even if not explicitly stated by the customer, awareness of and researching and showing compliance with relevant standards is crucial to avoiding compliance risk. If a system is delivered per the customer requirements, but yet fails system validation and the customer tries to get it approved, they're going to want to try to put blame on the supplier. Says, you didn't cover this. And they kind of expect you to do that even if the customer left that out of their list of standards and regulations. So when you're developing products for a customer, organizations define business and business operation requirements concerning standards and regulations. which apply to all projects within the organization. So for cases where there's a customer-supplier relationship, as this figure shows, the customer organization is going to have compliance requirements, as well as the supplier organization, higher level, is going to have those. So the supplier developed system, the projects that are actually doing the work, they're going to have to integrate this from both the customer and supplier. That could be a problem if there's conflicts. For standards that are required by a customer regulatory organizations may be able to do some kind of an equivalency check. So as a supplier organization, we already address those standards and regulations. We have a quality management system. We have design controls already in place. And so rather than meeting the specific customer regulatory standard regulation requirements, maybe you can show that their internal standards meet the intent of the customer regulatory agency required standards, and thus are equivalent. And this approach is based on what the customer regulatory agency allows equivalency assessment. In some cases, they may accept the supplier's existing processes and methods to reduce cost and time to delivery. Example of this is having a European soldering standard on the contract that specifies the standard released in the United States or the other way around, or a project, like I said, already has a quality management system and design controls in place, and that's applicable to that product line, and thus can show equivalence. For projects developing a system of interest for a customer, specific requirements for activities and contract deliverables must be defined in the statement of work or supplier agreement, making the activities and deliverables contractually binding. Statement of work should make clear what role the customer and supplier are going to have in system verification, system validation, production verification activities. In some cases, the supplier is responsible for verification the system of interest meets the design input requirements, associated acceptance artifacts. In other cases, the customers can assume responsibility for the validation once the verified system has been delivered to them, and the customer may require supplier support in these activities. But if that's true, that needs to be addressed in the statement of work so that when the supplier bids on the contract, they can include those activities in their bid. Section 13 of the Needs and Requirements Manual goes into a lot more detail on customer-supplier relationships, when the system of interest is being developed specifically for customer via contract. Now that we've identified this, then we need to come up with concepts organizationally, how we're going to deal with the standards and regulations. So again, from the Needs and Requirements Manual, the different activities that we're doing when it comes to lifecycle concept needs definition, the standard things is, defining the problem threat, defining mission goals and objectives and measures. A lot of these may be done at higher levels. And then we're going to identify internal, external stakeholders. We're going to elicit stakeholder needs and requirements, document the elicitation outcomes. As part of this, we're going to be identifying drivers' constraints, which includes the relevant standards and regulations, and identify risk and handle risk, including the compliance risks that I talked about. So at the system project level, the identification of relevant standards and regulations is going to come from several different sources. A higher level organizational business requirements from both the supplier organization and the customer in the customer statement of work or supplier agreement, the elicitation activities that we do with the stakeholders at the system level, and then just the project research to identify drivers' constraints. Once identified, the relevant standards and regulations are inputs into the lifecycle concepts analysis and maturation activities. This is a general model of how all this kind of fits together, with standards and regulations being a major constraint into the lifecycle concepts analysis and maturation activities that we do. And based on these activities, we want to come up with feasible lifecycle concepts are defined, which the integrated set of needs is defined and baseline that address the relevant standards and regulations that we decided that we're going to show compliance with. And if we're dealing with the system of interest, then we want to make sure that we're dealing only with standards that are appropriate for the system of interest. So the project team must do this analysis for each relevant standard regulation, which apply to the project's processes and methods, which ones apply to the actual system of interest, design input or design output, which applies to the system verification and validation that will result in objective evidence of compliance, which apply to qualification, certification, acceptance. And in each case, the project has to develop concepts for each one of these. They're all different. And they're going to be documented in different places. These concepts needs to include determine the methods, tools, data, information needed to document, manage, and provide the required evidence that's going to be included in the approval package that's going to be submitted to the approving authorities. To be successful, these concepts must be defined at the beginning of the projects. And so in a data-centric practice of system engineering, concepts developed at the business and business operation levels and associated tools and processes are then leveraged by the projects at the project level. And the business level requirements can be tailored to the enterprise to meet the intent of the standards and regulations for their specific product line and can be recorded and managed within a tool that supports libraries and reuse. The key consideration when assessing standards and regulations is feasibility of compliance within program constraints. Just like any needs or requirements, we put them in a bucket. We should always be doing this assessment based on cost, technology, and schedule, and also assessing the risk. We understand every requirement in response to a standard regulation does have cost and schedule implications. So those implications we need to assess at the beginning, especially the customer needs to assess this when they're issuing contracts. And it's got to be part of the lifecycle concept needs definition activities before we define design input requirements. And the baseline integrated set of needs, which defines the scope of the project, must individually and as a set be feasible, including the feasibility in terms of what resources, costs, and time are required to provide evidence of compliance to those standards and regulations. So once we have gathered all the information, we went through our lifecycle concepts analysis and maturation, then we have to split out 3 different streams of our needs. We have people needs on the organization. We go into statement of work, project plans, process requirements that go into processes, work instructions, and then we have the requirements on our system of interest itself. And we're going to define a set of needs for that, plan for how we're going to verify and validate that we have a good set of needs, baseline the lifecycle concepts and needs, and then that feeds into our design input requirements, definition activities. But it's important that we do split out these people needs, process needs, product needs, because they're going to be treated differently. They're documented differently. How are you going to verify and validate you've met those? They're done differently. I've seen so many cases where in a technical spec, they call out a standard when I know that that standard has all 3 of these in, and the standard's not invoked in any other place. So it's not appropriate to document people and process needs and requirements in a technical spec for a product, but it happens all the time. All the boxes here have a transformation that takes place, and those transformation are the activities the organization is doing to transform something into something else. And so the organization needs to define the needs and definition requirements for each of those transformations, and they drive all those activities. So a lot of standards deal with the organization, how they're going to do this. What are the standards, like 15288, it outlines all these lifecycle processes. ISO, IEEE has a ton of different standards on how the organization is going to do each of these transformations. There's standards on requirements, there's standards on architecture, there's standards on design, there's standards on manufacturing, on integration, and there's standards for how we operate, maintain, dispose of our systems. So the design controls are part of an overall quality management system that an organization defines. And this terminology comes from the medical device world, but I think it applies to any kind of system that we're developing. There's standards dealing with all these design controls in the quality management system. So the organizations need to make sure that those are all identified for the organization and the process and put in place the governance at the organizational level above the project level. And then the projects will follow those requirements, all those design controls. Historically, requirements refer to relevant standards and regulations at the document level or sections within a document, rather than defining specific individual well-formed derived requirements tailored to the system being developed. And I'll get into a lot more about that, but this approach results in poorly formed requirements being included in our set of design input requirements, which in turn results in issues concerning allocation, traceability, verification, and validation, as well as cost and schedule issues. If in my design input requirements, I have the medical device shall conform to all requirements and standards so-and-so, and that standard has 100 requirements, how do I cost that? How am I going to allocate that one requirement to other parts of the architecture when it actually represents 100 other requirements? How do I do traceability? If each of those actually apply, then I have to plan for verification and the cost of that and include time and schedule for the verification of all of those. So that's not really a good approach. By not doing this work, the project is accumulating what we call technical debt. That's a metaphor made up by Warren Cunningham, one of the authors of the Agile Manifesto, to describe what occurs when a project team uses a quick short-term solution that will require additional development work later to meet the needs of the stakeholders. From a project perspective, technical debt refers to the eventual consequences of poor project management and system engineering practices. So technical debt is closely related to project and technical risk, especially the compliance risk I talked about. Not performing key activities early in the development lifecycle adds a risk to the project due to consequences not doing those activities. So it's not kicking the can down the road. If I just have a requirement that the system shall meet these particular requirements in the standard, but I haven't done any research as to exactly what I need to do to meet those requirements in the standard, who makes that decision? Do I just leave it up to the design team? I'm talking about a lot of cost, money, and risk and associated with that. Not a good way to do it, but that's how it's been done in the past. One reason we don't want to do this is technical debt accumulates interest on top of interest. It's like taking out a loan, you got to pay back the interest, and interest builds on interest cost. And so we need to avoid this and do this upfront work concerning our standards and regulations and not kick it down the road and let someone else worry about it. So failing to adequately identify relevant standards and regulations, define concepts for compliance, and driving specific requirements tailored to the system of interest being developed, definitely adds to the project's technical debt and to the compliant risk. So the next is transforming needs dealing with the relevant standards and regulations into the design input requirements. There's some general considerations I want to talk, kind of the pink elephant in the room when it comes to standards and regulations. Like I said before, many standards and regulations contain at least 3 types of requirements: the process, the technical requirements in the system, and requirements how we're going to do system verification and validation activities. And it's important that we don't mix these requirements in the set of design input requirements. The design input requirement system of interest should only include the technical requirements that are design inputs. They're going to have to be implemented in the design and verify the design and the system meets those requirements. So organizations are going to have to go through and look at all these. So for any given standard regulation, does it apply to a process? If so, where are we going to document it? Where are these processes in there? We're going to put it in a project management plan, an acquisition plan, an integrated verification validation plan, all the different kind of project plans. If it has to do with the contractor, we're going to put in a statement of work or supplier agreement and so on. For requirements that deal with the processes, we got to make this decision up front as part of our lifecycle concept and analysis. For technical requirements, then those definitely want to include in our technical requirements. And for requirements dealing with system verification, validation, and certification should be included in our verification, validation, test plan, and artifacts. Now, there's a little bit of overlap between those kind of requirements and our system requirements, because there may be a qualification requirement that says the system burst pressure has to be 3 sigma of what the normal operating pressure is. So from a design standpoint, the design team is going to have to design the system according to that burst pressure, not just the operating pressure. And so there are some times where the requirements for qualification may result in actual technical requirements for a system of interest. And then not all standards contain requirements, the actual shell statements. There's a requirement that invokes the standard in the shell statement, but within the standard, it may not have any shell statements. Some standards have both shall statements, which are binding and will be verified, as well as goals, which are should statements whose purposes communicate best practices that the project's encouraged to follow. How you deal with shall statements versus should statements, when a customer says you need to follow a certain process to develop it, that's something you have to work out with the customer and which ones you have to show compliance with. In most cases, standards and regulations are called out by document section number, but there's different versions of those. And so the organizations have to determine which version actually applies. In a traditional document-centric practice of SE, that listing up front that's called applicable documents usually includes what the specific version is for that document. Standards and regulations are going to change over time. So organizations need a policy and supporting processes to determine how the changes are going to be managed for the relevant standards and regulations requirements based on their product line. Not all changes will have an impact on an organization's projects and products. If not impacted by a change, then updates to your design input requirements or your processes aren't necessary. There are some changes that will have an impact, and a change to regulation or law or an interface document that you have no choice. You have to change to be compliant with that changed standard or that regulation or the ICD. There also may be changes that do affect your product, but not a critical function or its intended use in its operational environment. In these cases, there should be some kind of provisions to grandfather the changes so that current project products don't have to be compliant. They don't have to redesign something, but any new versions of products will be compliant. So organizations must have processes that enables the organization to be knowledgeable of any standard regulation changes, as well as knowledge of which projects could be impacted by those changes. And usually this is something done in the configuration management or compliance office. I've taught classes for organizations that said they weren't aware of any organizational group that was keeping track of changes and weren't being notified whether the standard or regulation that's applicable to their project has been changed. So this could pose a problem when you go to seek approval and then find out that there was an expectation by the approving authority that you were compliant with the latest version of the standard regulation and you're compliant with an older version. So organizations need to deal with change. And it's also important to understand that requirements and regulations are written generically at a level of abstraction that's applicable to a class of products, but not necessarily the specific product being developed by the organization or specific project. Because of this, there's always an expectation of tailoring requirements to apply to an organization's specific product line. So I have this generic requirement, and the expectation is you're going to derive a specific requirement for your system of interest that meets the intent of that generic requirement in the standard regulation. Another problem is that requirements and standards regulations do not have the characteristics of well-formed requirements as defined in the COSI Guide to Writing Requirements. I've read so many requirements and standards that are very poorly written, and part of it's because they are on purpose written generically. It's hard to understand what the intent really is and how you'd actually show that you met the intent of that requirement. In many cases, the standards don't include rationale that can be helped to understand what the intent is. I wish the standards organizations would pay more attention to the quality of the requirements contained within their standards. And the same with the regulatory agencies. They need to pay more attention to the quality of the requirements in the regulations. But I guess that keeps the lawyers employed dealing with all that ambiguity. There's also cases where standards contain specific design implementation, like I said before, mechanical design drawings, without communicating what the actual concern is. So those are going to be design constraints because we're going to have to include them even though they violate the design input rule of avoid design implementation. Sometimes an organization has good rationale for that design implementation. Then it would be very good if they included rationale for that design implementation. Projects should try to strive to understand this and define well-formed design input requirements. If the organizations really understand the intent of the design implementation, the design solution maybe been a good solution 10 years ago, that maybe there's a better way of dealing with that in today's world. And so maybe if that intent was better known and understood, the supplier may have a better way of meeting the intent than what was there. And that's one reason why we try to avoid implementation whenever we can. And also, more than one subsystem or system element may play a role in meeting the intent. So by defining the applicable design input requirement at the appropriate level, it can be allocated to different subsystems or systems that have a role in meeting that intent. By giving a specific implementation for one subsystem, that leaves out the other subsystems that may also have a role. And this is especially important considering today's increasingly complex software intensive systems where many issues can be addressed by software rather than hardware. I read a report that had to deal with the software eating the automobile. They talked about that a lot of performance issues in the automobile, especially when it comes to emission controls, rather than fix the problem with a mechanical fix, the problem is actually fixed with a software fix. And so we need to get used to this idea. Another problem that we run into a lot is it's common for a standard or regulation to call out other standards and regulations that contain requirements. I read a paper not long ago where someone's doing an assessment of all the ISO standards that feed into 15288. The way all the standards refer to each other, it looked like a big spider web. It was really a complex web of interactions between the standards. From a project standpoint, this can be a very serious issue when one document calls out another, and that document calls out another, and so on. And each one is calling out requirements. Failing to address this, the organization and project teams have lost control of their projects because they no longer have a say into if or which of the lower tier requirements actually apply, and they're going to have to show compliance. So one way to address this issue, and I advise to my students, is that if you consider your set of design input requirements as tier 1, and any requirement in the standard regulation invoked directly by a requirement in a tier 1 is considered tier 2, and if that tier 2 requirement calls out requirements in another document, those would be tier 3. Then the organization, they should say, is any tier 3 or lower requirements are not applicable. If any requirements within tier 3 or lower doc do apply, they will be addressed directly within the set of tier 1 design input requirements. And in the past, it's been a customary practice to call out entire standards or regulations or sections within a requirement statement. The system of interest shall be compliant with all applicable ISO standards. And I know a lot of you are cringing at that. Shall be compliant with all requirements within FDA regulation XYZ, or shall meet all requirements within OSHA Reg XYZ section 45911. But in the first example, who determines which requirements are applicable? Because they're passive, who do they really apply to? It says shall be. So is it really a requirement that applies to the system of interest, or does it apply to a project process that's used to develop the system of interest? In the second and third examples, how is it certain that all the requirements being referenced are really applicable? And again, it's not kicking the can down the road, letting someone else determine this. So it's dangerous to call out a complete standard regulation when only a portion of requirements apply. All requirements invoked within the set of design input requirements will have to be implemented in the design and the system verified to meet those requirements. And this is a real issue if you're contracting to a supplier who's contracted to implement all the requirements in the set. The owner or the stakeholder needed requirements must do the analysis and determine and communicate their needs concerning which standards and regulations the system of interest must comply. And so the result would be separate need statements for each applicable standard, regulation, or section within that standard or regulation. So you could end up with quite a few different need statements depending on how many applicable standards and regulations and sections do apply. An example of resulting stakeholder need: the stakeholders need the system of interest to be compliant with OSHA safety regulation XYZ section 123, and then the resulting stakeholder requirement may be the system of interest shall be compliant with OSHA safety regulation section 123. What often happens is the stakeholder requirement is then copied and pasted into the set of system technical requirements. That's not a good practice. So while intended, the requirement statement does not have the characteristics of a well-formed requirement. It's not singular, it's ambiguous, and as it's written, it's not verifiable. But sadly, this is the approach that I've seen quite a bit in the past. Another common issue is just adding a shall to a need statement, calling it a requirement, where you have the stakeholders need the system to be compliant with all safety regulations, and then they'll just say shall be compliant or compliant with all or all applicable. But just putting a shall in a need statement does not make it a good requirement. While well-intended, they're all too vague to verify or validate their poor requirements. In either case, there are multiple issues with requirements stated in the standards and regulations. As discussed previously, the quality of the requirement standard regulation is often lacking and their intent's unclear. Often there's no rationale. So standard regulation contains hundreds of requirements, of which only a portion apply to the actual system under development. So who determines which one's applicable? In some cases, requirements in one standard regulation may be inconsistent or contradict a requirement in another similar standard or regulation. Will all the requirements in the document section invoked by the design input requirement be allocated the same way to the system elements within the architecture? Are they going to be verified the same way? And there are multiple standards organizations. Sometimes they're contradictory or inconsistent. Which standard should an organization be compliant? I just read on LinkedIn today where someone is quoting the definition of ConOps and OpsCon in an ISO standard, but then someone else quoted a NASA standard that reversed the definitions. So in reality, when we have multiple standards for any one thing, there isn't a standard. So that can be a problem as to determining which standard organization you decide to be compliant with. Another key issue in calling out standard regulation, the question of design and system verification. Each requirement in the invoked document section will have to be implemented in the design and design system verified to meet those requirements. All the system verification attributes will be defined as success criteria, strategy, and method would need to be defined for each of the requirements. And the system verification artifacts discussed in section 10 of the needs and requirements manual would have to be developed. If I invoke in one requirement 100 other requirements, where is all this information defined? Again, kicking the can down the road. And the cost and schedule implications verifying all those requirements hasn't been considered up front, which can lead to a lot of overruns. Doing this can involve a lot of time and resources. If each project within the organization did this, especially if the requirements in the standard regulation are poorly written and the intent's not clear. So for all cases when the development system of interest is contracted to supplier, who determines which requirements are applicable and who determines system verification attributes? Because of the cost and schedule implications, the customer can't just kick the can down the road to the supplier. The customer needs to be involved in this up front and then reflect that in the statement of work. Invoking all portions, there's a definite risk to both the customer and supplier. And if it's not clearly communicated, that you can have expensive contract disputes and changes. So what should happen when transforming needs, dealing with standards and regulations in the design input requirements is the project team responsible for this transformation must do the engineering analysis to determine which specific requirements within the regulations cited in the need apply to the system of interest under development versus the project or process requirement, whether it's requirements or design inputs on the design team and resulting design output specifications or the requirements on production. And for those that apply system of interest, what specifically would the system of interest do to meet the intent of those applicable requirements within standard? So you're going to write specific, the system of interest shall do X, Y, Z, and a well-formed requirement that can be traced back to the parent requirement in the standard regulation. So based on the analysis, project team would then derive specific well-formed design input requirements that when implemented by the design would result in the intent. While this can result in a large number of requirements, each would be well-formed, making it clear what's expected to be addressed by the design against which both the design and realized system be verified against, and the associated cost and schedule implications addressed up front. So like I said before, the organizational level, the governance of all the standards and regulations need to be determined. What applies to the product line, what applies to the projects, all the processes and stuff need to be in place for all the products and services developed by the organization. And then for each relevant standard regulation, the organization should clearly establish which requirements within the relevant standard are applicable. And ideally, those are applicable requirements within the relevant standards would have been able to be imported into the organization's toolset database in a form that allows the organization to create reusable libraries, allow the organization to assign applicability of the standards and regulations to specific projects and systems to be developed, and allow the projects to establish traces from their implementing requirements to the applicable standard and regulations. Now, the standard regulations are really picky about what you do with their particular requirements, and you may have to buy rights from those organizations to get permission to include those in a given tool set. One way to establish applicability to specific projects or services, develop an applicability matrix for each relevant standard regulation. In the applicability matrix for each applicable standard or regulation, individual requirements are listed as row headings. For each row, an X is placed in any column to which a requirement identified for the row applies. In a requirement management tool, that X represents a link or a trace. With this approach, need statements with the integrated needs would invoke the columns within the applicability matrices. For example, the stakeholders need the system of interest to comply with regulation XYZ requirements as indicated in column C of regulation XYZ for project A. Using this approach, the project team would then know which specific requirements apply to their project. And this can also be used within the system of interest to further show applicability to subsystems and system elements using the same approach. So with the applicability matrix, the organization for each standard, they could take, okay, here's the requirements that are applicable to our organization product lines. And then for the projects within our organization, these are what requirements are applicable to each project. And so like project A is getting a requirement 1, 3, 5, 6, and 7. And then project A then could go and do a further analysis and say, well, requirement 1, 6, and 7 deal with our processes. 3 and 5 deal with technical content and verification and validation. So now they know where they're going to document and how they're going to react to each of the requirements in that particular standard, and they'll drive the appropriate requirements and document in the appropriate places for making this happen. Now, the number of requirements invoked in project dealing standards can be large, taking considerable time, resources, money, manage, implement, and show compliance. For process-focused standard regulations, the organization can define their own processes and methods and develop an environment in response to the standards and regulations. And like I said before, then from a contracting perspective, the customer can then require the suppliers to discuss in their proposal their equivalent processes that meet the intent of the customer invoked standards or regulations on dealing with the processes and methods. For the technical requirements, rather than calling out requirements contained in the standards regulation, the organization could develop their own version of each standard regulation requirements tailored to the product lines, and these could be put into libraries that could be used by the projects. So the result can be often a smaller number of requirements that clearly communicate the intent and expectations, but should be implemented more effectively. And then these, like I say, could be put in the organization's tool set in the form of libraries, establishing traceability between the organization's derived well-formed requirements and the applicable requirements and the source requirements. Because of the general nature of requirements within standards, it's a bad practice to copy and paste requirements of standard regulation in your sets of requirements. Again, I see a lot of organizations do that.
Lou, can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes.
If the regulation actually had a well-written requirement and you've determined it is applicable, could you just take it and put it in your set of requirements?
Oh, sure.
Okay, so I always view it as a bad practice to blindly copy and paste requirements. If it's thoughtfully done, you could reuse it.
Yes.
Okay.
If it has all the characteristics defined in the INCOSE Guide to Routing Requirements, you rewrote it for your system of interest shell, and it has all those characteristics, then fine, you can use it. Unfortunately, I haven't seen that happen a whole lot, so that could be a problem. Now, if the organization has a library of derived requirements that they developed that are well formed, then definitely the projects are going to be able to copy and paste those that are applicable to their project into their requirement set. And it's very important that for each of the requirements derived by the organization, they have clear rationale concerning why that requirement's needed and how it's meeting the intent of the source requirement in the standard regulation. That's one of the characteristics of well-written requirements, is that they are needed and you have traceability. So for each requirement that's derived in response to standard regulation, we want that rationale and traceability to exist. And when driving equivalent requirements, the organization must, like I said, establish that traceability. As far as meeting the intent, you'd have to go back to the approving authorities to say, if we meet our derived requirements, well, we have met the intent of what you expect. If so, then that equivalency thing kicks in. And this approach is preferred from a reusability standpoint in that it would save considerable time and money, not requiring individual products to repeat the actions over and over again. If you don't develop the libraries like this, each project is forced to reinvent the wheel, adding considerable cost and time to the project, as well as that risk of non-compliance. An added benefit is that the requirement management tool used to establish the libraries can keep track of projects that are using the requirements in the library, as well as how they were tailored for the specific projects. If they see similar tailoring for multiple projects, they can use this information maybe to update the requirements in the library after getting approval from the approving authorities before doing so. And then other added benefits is they can better assess the applicability of a change to standard regulations, at the organization level. They'll know which projects are possibly affected by the change, and they can address the changes in one place. And so a lot of advantage to doing this. The follow-on presentation that Carrie's going to give is going to talk more about actually developing libraries within a tool. So this is a good segue into Carrie's presentation. This next section, we're going to talk about system verification, system validation. Like the note says, while I'm focusing on standards and regulations, compliance, this section applies to all needs and requirements. When we're talking about system verification, system validation, we're talking about system verification. Did we build it right? So the realized system, we're verifying against the design input requirements. And the system validation, did we build the right thing? We're validated against the integrated set of needs, which comes from the lifecycle concept and needs definition activities I showed earlier. So all needs statements must be structured and worded in such a way that its realization can be validated by the approving authority's satisfaction. Unless a needs statement is written in a way that allows requirement validation, design validation, and system validation, there's no way to tell whether it has been satisfied or obligation has been met. So each need must include the necessary information such that validation success criteria can be defined, and the system of interest can be validated such that sufficient evidence can be gathered to determine whether the success criteria has been met, i.e. there's no ambiguity regarding the need statement, what it communicates, and there's no missing characteristics within the need. It's conforming and complete and unvalidatable. Need can result in multiple objective observers, for example, requirement writers, architects, designers, or testers, interpreting the need differently, making it difficult to validate that the requirement design or system of interest meets the needs. So each need statement dealing with standards regularization must be well-formed, must be validatable. Similarly, all requirement statements must be structured and worded such that its realization can be verified to the approving authority's satisfaction. Unless a requirement statement is written in a way that allows design verification or system verification, there's no way to tell if it has been satisfied and the obligation has been met. Each requirement statement must include the necessary information such that, again, verification success criteria can be defined, the system of interest can be verified such that sufficient evidence can be gathered to assess whether the success criteria has been met, and there's no ambiguity regarding what the requirement statement communicates, and there's no missing characteristics within the requirement. An unverifiable requirement can result in multiple objective observers, for example, designers or testers, interpreting the requirement differently, making it difficult to verify the system of interest meets the requirement. This is really the basis of what I said earlier, that one is often the quality and standards and regulations is fairly poor, in that what I've said here is not true. And one reason why the organization typically then needs to derive their own requirement that meets the intent of the standard regulation requirement, but they write it in such a way that what I've said on here is true. It does have these characteristics and it is verifiable. And verifiability and compatibility is a necessary condition for establishing the characteristics appropriate, unambiguous, complete, singular, feasible, conforming, consistent, and comprehensible. So verifiability and validability should be addressed as the initial criterion and a basis for examining these other characteristics. Verifiable validatable is about design and system verification and requirement design and system validation, showing that the requirements can be validated against the need. The design can be verified, validated such that when realized, it results in a system of interest that meets the requirement or need. And the realized system of interest can be verified and validated that it meets the requirement or need. So we need to write each requirement and need statement in a way that allows the design or system to be verified, validated that the requirement need has been met by one of the four verification validation methods: inspection, analysis, demonstration, or test. When writing requirement and need statements, we should use the verification validation point of view and imagine yourself performing the verification and validation activity and define what evidence is needed to assess whether the need or requirement intent has been achieved as defined by the success criteria with the required level of confidence. In the Needs and Requirements Manual, Section 10 goes into a lot of detail on system verification and validation. This is one of the figures showing all the different artifacts that are developed. So each need or requirement is a verification validation instance. If you're doing modeling, the word instance comes in. So for each one of these, we're going to develop a bunch of artifacts. And in the end, we end up with a qualified, certified, accepted system. And again, refer to Section 10 for a much more detailed description of this whole process. A big thing here, I talk about the success criteria, strategy, and method. It's a recommended best practice when you define any requirement, but especially for the standards and regulation requirements. The success criteria is used to plan what strategy and method you're going to use, and that's going to define a specific verification validation activity, which is implemented through procedure requirements, which is implemented through a verification and validation procedure, which contains individual steps and activities that are executed during a verification validation event. And the result of that is documented in execution record, which is used to provide the evidence of satisfaction. And then with that, the organization can make a decision: did we pass the success criteria? Did we meet it or not? If there's a discrepancy, we got to go resolve that. If not, we approve that action and we can move on and do our other requirements. And when we do this, the quality of the requirement needs statement will improve, resulting in needs and requirements that are verifiable and validatable. But we have to be thinking ahead: how would we verify and validate the system against the needs or requirements? And so these must be defined for each need and requirement dealing with the standards and regulations. And it's important that when we're going through this, there's a thought process. So we have the need or design input requirement statement, which, like I said, represents the verification and validation instance. We define the success criteria. From that, we define the strategy, select a method. But then we need to go through and look at the cost, schedule, risk, confidence level, enabling systems required based on what we just decided, and we need to assess feasibility. And if it's not feasible, we may need to change the need or requirement wording. We may need to redefine the success criteria based on that change in wording. Maybe we come up with a different strategy and a method. All this planning starts with the success criteria, and we need to do this feasibility assessment. And the customer and supplier should agree on these attributes, because defining verification, validation, success criteria, strategy, and method are cost, schedule, and risk decisions. And I talked about confidence level because that's important. It may be that supplier wants to do a cheaper way. Maybe they want to do analysis or demonstration rather than test to save money. But that may not result in the confidence level the customer needs to go, or the approving authority needs to say that that requirement's been met. So there needs to be some give and take in there. And like I say, it is a cost schedule risk decision. And for customer supplier relationships, that needs to be addressed in the contract. So now that we've done all this, we have to document the evidence of compliance. And so I talked about an execution record for each verification and validation activity that's completed for each verification validation procedure associated with that activity. The execution record states the status and outcome of the activity in terms of whether the results provide sufficient evidence that the success criteria for each system verification validation instance were met, and the family of execution records for system of interest is combined into approval packages. Execution records formally document the results of the execution of the procedures. There'll be one execution record for each activity. The results of the procedures are recorded in one or more forms of objective evidence. And the evidence can take the form of a formal report, a data set, or some type of form. And regardless of this form, each piece of objective evidence must be uniquely identifiable and stored in configuration management document or database. So execution record should contain the following types of information, and actually some kind of unique identifier, because there's going to be traceability, all this information. I'll talk about that a little bit more. When was the procedure completed? Where was it done? Who's the organization that did the procedure? What quality control processes were used to manage the integrity of the data collected? The name of the quality people involved in the test and signed off. What was the success criteria that was met? What strategy and method was used? The environment, any special conditions? The description and form of the data collected? The analysis that was done to determine whether the success criteria is met, and some statement of conformance or non-conformance by the executing organization and person doing the analysis and making the pass-fail judgment. And the preparation of the execution records will often be done concurrently with the closeout of verification validation procedure. Once the execution records are complete, they're assembled along with any other information needed by the approving authorities into approval packages for submittal to the approving authorities. In addition to the execution records, other records could include a certificate of conformance. If there's any waivers, deviation, or exceptions, they need to be addressed. Which ones are approved? Really important is there any that are open and have not been resolved and have not been approved? Evidence in a component end-item data packages, the design output specifications such as materials and parts list or a test report, evidence collected during the build, post-production artifacts, evidence that demonstrates the design was developed in accordance with approved design controls, and evidence that demonstrates the device was manufactured in accordance with approved processes and the design output specifications for the system, which we refer to in the needs and requirements manuals, production verification. So as an example, for medical devices developed under the oversight of the Federal Drug Administration, CFR Title 21, Part 820 defines the processes and organizations must follow and the set of records that must be developed, maintained, and submitted to the FDA to get medical device approved for its intended use. And the requirements in this regulation include the key definitions, process including design inputs, design outputs, specification, design reviews, design verification, design validation, process validation, and other definitions. And a lot of this information was referred to in the needs and requirements manual and the other products because it really applies to all systems that we're developing. To me, it's very logical how they put this all together. The FDA requires specific records to be kept. There's a design history file. It's a compilation of records which describes the design history of the finished device. It contains the references to records necessary to demonstrate the design was developed in accordance with the approved design plan and design input requirements, and the results of design verification, including identification of the design, methods, the date, the individual performing the verification, are all documented within the design history file. There's also the device history record. It's a compilation of records containing the production history of the device. And there's a requirement that each manufacturer has to maintain the device history record. Each manufacturer is required to establish and maintain procedures to ensure the design history records for each batch, lot, or unit are maintained to demonstrate that the device is manufactured in accordance with the device master record and the requirements for this part. And then we have the device master record, which is a compilation of records containing the procedures and specifications for a finished device. And you have location information of all your design output specifications, which you built the system to, including drawings, composition, formulation, component specifications, software specifications, production processes, quality assurance procedures, packaging and labeling, installation, maintenance, and servicing procedures. And the total product consists of the device, its packaging, labeling, and the device master record. So very well defined. And there's a ton of ISO standards for each one of these things, including risk management, quality management systems, design controls for the medical device world. I mean, there really are hundreds of standards, and quite a few of them deal with organization developing the product, and then others deal with the product itself. The project must maintain and manage records to provide a chain of evidence of compliance to the relevant standards and regulations. And this chain of evidence is very important. The chain of evidence, it could be very complex given the various levels and needs, design input requirements, the design implementation of those requirements, the design output specifications, manufacturing coding that implemented those specifications, and the system verification, system validation artifacts developed and gathered. So we may have a system level set of requirements, then we have subsystem sets of requirements, system element sets of needs and requirements. All of those are linked together. All those have verification validation associated with them. So you could end up with thousands of verification validation instances, hundreds of execution records, including the system verification and system validation approval packages, depending on the size and complexity. So managing this chain of evidence of compliance is often the responsibility of this organization's internal compliance and quality group I talked about before. So they would be responsible for configuration management of the sets of needs and requirements, the resulting system integration, system verification, system validation artifacts, making sure the intent of the standards and regulations are being met, ensuring objective evidence needed to determine compliance and obtain certification, qualification, acceptance is properly documented and submitted to the regulation agency. So this organization has a very big role in product development when it comes to the standards and regulations. How well this is done can make the big difference between your product being rejected or accepted. And many regulatory agencies, as well as the customers, will want the product to show traceability between the requirements and relevant standards, the concepts to meet them, the resulting design input requirements, the implementing architecture and design, the design output specifications, production verification, the realized system, and the project system verification, system validation activities that result in objective evidence that can be used to show the intent of the applicable requirements and the relevant standards and regulations have been met. So this traceability is fundamental to defining and maintaining the chain evidence of compliance. And digital threads across the lifecycle are a basis of establishing this chain of evidence. And that's one of the big things that we talk about in MBSE is establishing these digital threads that allow us to define and maintain the chain of evidence of compliance. And standard regulations existing in various industries require traceability to establish across the lifecycle. ARP for civil aircraft and systems requires requirements dealing with safety be uniquely identified and traceable. ISO 13485 for medical devices, methods to ensure traceability. Road vehicles, functional safety requirements should be traceable. So traceability is not an option really, and defining that chain of evidence, it's actually required by the standards and regulations themselves. And the same is true with medical devices with Title 21 Part 820, is that traceability is a key part of developing the device history file, establishing that chain of evidence. And failure to show required traceability can lead to product not being approved. historical organization defined and recorded the data and information associated with various artifacts in the form of documents. As systems become more complex and regulated, the sheer volume of documentation has become overwhelming, especially in terms of configuration management, change control, completeness, correctness, and consistency. And because of the complexity, there are more people involved in the development of these systems spread over different geographical locations. And this can result in many of the documents being developed, managed in the silos with limited collaboration. As a result, you can see a lot of inconsistencies. So it's nearly impossible to keep all the data information contained in various documents in sync, current, correct, and consistent, resulting in no real authoritative source of truth. So for highly regulated systems, the amount of documentation that must be developed, maintained, and supplied to regulators to show compliance has become overwhelming. The inconsistencies in these documents can result in the system to fail system validation, not approved for use, and the cost and time overhead associated with managing the large number of documents consumes a large part of the development cost. And this time overhead results in longer development times, time to market for many systems, making a company less competitive and less profitable. Additionally, quality suffers, resulting in post-system launch costs associated with increases in returns, recalls, warranty work, and company image degradation associated with negative social media comments. All of these eat into profits. So for today's increasingly complex software-intensive systems, it's very difficult to maintain traceability and the chain of evidence of compliance using a document-centric practice of system engineering. The emphasis of, and the real purpose in my mind of MBSE is to move from a document-centric practice of system engineering to a data-centric practice system engineering. So at the beginning of your project, you must choose to develop your product using data-centric practice of system engineering, which allows establishing traceability across the lifecycle activities and artifacts. The first step is selecting your tool set and determining which data information will be defined and managed within the tool set. Then the second step is defining a traceability relationship model, addressing which relationships will be established and managed with traceability within your tool set. And this needs to be defined up front. And then hopefully the tool will allow you to define rules and enforce compliance to the organization of establishing and maintaining the correct traceability, so the chain of evidence then can be shown to the regulatory authorities. And because of the number of system verification, the system validation artifacts, it's recommended that organizations use a dedicated application to define and manage those. Within the tool set, you have all these different artifacts associated with system verification, system validation. It'd be great to be able to manage these in one place. In doing this, you want to make sure there's compatibility to link the data in this application to other data developed and managed within other tools in the product's tool set. So using a dedicated application to manage the system verification, system validation artifacts, you want a tool set that supports sharing and linking the data between tools, supports the development of an integrated federated data set that represents an authoritative source of truth, supports digital threads traceability across all SE artifacts, no matter the tool used, supports change impact assessment, that allows the use of attributes to maintain your project using dashboards. And the needs and requirements manual goes into a lot more features your tool set should have. But in the end, you're going to have a tool set that consists of your requirement management tools, like shown on the left, any other dedicated management tools that you use for risk management, configuration management, dedicated tools for verification and validation. On the right, you have your language-based modeling tools, you have your physical configuration items, but a key thing is in the center is some kind of data integration tool that supports linking the data information developed in different tools. Fortunately, there are several organizations, vendors that are supplying that data integration tool. I know the reuse company in Spain has done a lot of work in this area, being able to tie all the different applications together so you can have consistency and you can have an authoritative source of truth within your organization. So the last topic in here is obtaining approval. So the approval packages are submitted to the approving authorities for approval. The approving authority is any individual, group of individuals, or organization that has the authority to approve the system for use in its operational environment by its intended users. The approving authorities could be any combination of internal, external customers, a regulatory agency, or a third-party certification organization. For a lot of the ISO standards dealing with processes, a lot of times there will be an organization will come in and certify that the organization is compliant with this group of standards. That's a valuable certification to have. And then suppliers can put that in their proposals that they have the certification so that that can be used as evidence that they have met quite a few of the standards and regulations maybe the customer is requiring. The approving authorities decide what constitutes what's necessary for acceptance and determines if the system of interest meets that criteria. And the approval process should be well defined within the project's project management plan, system engineering management plan, master integration verification validation plan, and system integration validation plans. If it's a contract, it should be well defined within the statement of work as well. For regulatory agencies, the approval process is often defined as part of the regulations governing the system of interest under development. And I showed for standards organizations, a lot of them are requiring traceability in order to tie all this information together. Some organizations, before they submit their approval packages to the approving authorities, they'll have their own internal system acceptance review or readiness for use reviews to make sure they've dotted all the I's, crossed all the T's, so that when the approval package is given to the approval authorities, they have a lot greater chance of acceptance. So assuming the project follows the processes defined by the approving authorities and successfully completed the system verification, system validation activities defined in the needs and requirement manual and other guides, the risk of non-approval, should be low. Sadly, this may not be the case. In the previous FDA example, one of the major reasons for a third of the programs being not approved was the failure to follow the required product development processes and failure to submit the required records to the approving authority. An example, the FDA. So for many products developed and used around the world, there's going to be multiple approving authorities, each with different defined approval processes and associated requirements for documentation records. In this case, the project will have to be in conformance compliance with each set of regulations and go through multiple system verification and system validation approval processes. And for like DoD programs, they have a development test evaluation process for system verification, an operational test and evaluation process for system validation. And Title IX of the US Code says that those processes should be conducted by different organizations. So, parting thoughts, the approval processes can be long, complex, and frustrating. Because of this, the focus of the project must be both on the approval process requirements that define what's necessary for approval, in addition to developing concepts associated with how they're going to meet the intent of the standards and regulations, developing concepts up front for how they're going to validate that the system meets the integrated set of needs, concepts for how they're going to verify the system meets the design input requirements associated with the standards and regulations, concepts for how they're going to establish and maintain the chain of evidence, and concepts for how the project is going to obtain approval. And both customers and suppliers must define the processes, method, tools, and environment associated with the approval process at the beginning of the project. These must be reflected in the budget and schedule, and these must be reflected in the supplier statement of work or supplier agreement. Specific activities supplier must accomplish and be involved in, and specific deliverables in their form and content. Wow, so kind of a fire hose presentation. I have a lot of words in this because a lot of people are going to want copies of the slide deck. So having the additional words in there will help in the future.
I did post it for anybody who wants to get a copy of it now. It should be up on the intranet site. We do have messages in the chat for you. I'm not sure if you've been monitoring that, Lou, but there's a couple questions in there as well.
Yeah, I looked at that a little bit during the break. First one here from Mike: for large facilities, there are often over 100 relevant standards applying to components, represents 10,000 plus requirements that need to be verified for hundreds of thousands of components. Do you have recommendations for dealing with such large scale? One of the things is this filtering process. Even though you have all those standards, making sure which ones apply to the processes, which ones apply to the product component itself from a design technical standpoint, and which ones apply to how you're going to attain a certification qualification of each of those components. That filtering process will put everything in its place. A lot of times I see a lot of standards being called out, but they have these different types and people really haven't, said anything about this. Mathis, you have a question?
Yes, Lou. I just want to compliment on what you said there. So first of all, hello everyone. It's my first working group meeting I'm attending. It's a very important topic. On this, it's a topic that I've been struggling with or following with in my company for the last several years now. On large infrastructure projects, there is indeed multiple international regulatory codes or standards that needs to be complied with to do the filtering, the assessing, and then to do the categorization as what you've proposed. We've got a different scheme that we use, but I'm at least glad to see that you also propose that you need to filter and analyze and categorize these different types of requirements. And it's indeed true to say that not each one of these standards contains well-written requirements. I've also seen many, many bad examples of codes and standards where the requirements is not written to a high degree of quality. And then also the practice of how the people are working with those standards, where they just apply and say the whole standard is applicable. But when you go pick it up and analyze it, each individual requirement on its own needs to be tested to see if it fulfills the necessary criteria. And only based on that, you can then state the requirement for your system of interest. So that's one challenge. And the other challenge is then also over the life cycle of a project. If from specifying the design basis until at the end where you do the qualification, it can be several years in large projects. And how do you keep track of all the justification and rationale, how the requirements were assessed to be applicable, and then keeping track if those requirements in those documents is updated over time. But by the point that you come to acceptance or qualification, that your product that you supply, your service that you supply is still in line with that agreement, because then also contract management comes into play, where the expectation is of the acquirer that you want the state-of-the-art system, which is in compliance with all the applicable codes and standards and the regulations at that time. But at the time of specifying the contract, they may have referenced an older version, or at that time, a version which was in force, but during the progress of the project, it changed. And then what do? You need to be proactive in the project instead of reactive at the point of qualification, because it may involve some significant penalties or charges to the project. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. It highlighted a few very interesting points that we are also working on. Thanks.
Thank you for your comments. You validated a lot of what I said, problems that we have with requirements in the standards and regulations. And your last comment, that's why it's important to have this organization within your organization. Whose sole purpose is to address compliance and address all the standards and regulations, establish the libraries within the organization so they can keep track of when changes occur. They can assess the applicability of those changes to the current product line, the impact on that product line. There was another comment is that, that whole thing about revisions of standards and regulations. You had a statement in the contract that said you have to adhere to all current revisions of standards of regulations. That's a really bad requirement to include in a contract, because then the supplier has lost control. Craig, you had your hand up.
Yes, this is something of maybe a David and Goliath type question, but we have real problems with the way our requirements are specified in standards and regulations, a real problem. And we have now these products, the Needs and Requirements Manual, the Guide to Needs and Requirements. Is there any effort or plan to be any effort to influence some of these standards organizations with this material? And that's why I described it as David and Goliath, because these standards bodies are much, much larger than INCOSE, right? And I could see where it would be difficult to get traction or influence, but I imagine that there is some activity in this area.
It is a real issue. I'm sure that there's some members of the standard organizations that are members of the requirement working group that have access to this. And I'm anticipating that this presentation may be viewed by many of those. That's one of the nice things about us being able to record these presentations and put them on our YouTube channel, is that groups like that can take advantage of the materials and they can address how they're going to deal with the issues. Back on the other question that we had about the large number, that's one of the things that, rather than trying to meet all the requirements and all the standards, is there's a lot of overlap between the standards. It may be that the organization that's derived sets of requirements, both process-wise and technical, could point to multiple standards. Maybe one organizational requirement could meet the intent of 4 or 5 requirements in a variety of different standards. So that's one thing that I know that NASA's done. They have a whole set of, they call NPRs, NASA procedure requirements, and different documents where they have tailored a lot of the international standards to apply to space systems. And then, like when I was working on the Constellation program, they developed their own set of standards that met the intent of not only the NASA standards, but the outside standards written by the standards organizations. Another question?
Sorry, Lou, this is Mike DeLamar. I can comment on the previous question about influencing the standards bodies. Because there's an effort right now, for example, within IOGP, which is an oil and gas community area, to work with the SDOs on that very issue, because what they are trying to do is to have a systems engineering approach across the oil and gas supply chain, starting from the SDOs to the oil and gas companies, to their major constructors, to all the supply chain underneath that. It's a big effort that's going on, but they're exploring all of those possibilities. I'm part of that task force with IOGP to help do that. They've asked me to attend a meeting that's going on that's called the SPAB, and don't ask me what it stands for. I can't remember, but basically it's a meeting of all the SDOs, or at least many of them. ISO doesn't attend, but ASME, API, many of them do attend. And this issue will be on the table, because what they are looking at is how will these standards be used in the future, particularly in a digital environment. So that is being examined. People want to influence that. They can take a look at that. I know the SPAB meeting takes place at the end of February this year, and that's just the beginning of the dialogue.
It was last year that they asked me to come and talk to them.
You're talking about IOGP?
Yeah. I gave a talk to them about a lot of these issues and gave them examples from their own documents of some of the issues with the requirements. It seems like they are aware of and wanting to rectify some of the past issues.
They have already started working with API and the Norwegian standards body on rewriting some of their standards, or at least the need for it, to have good requirements. Along with that, what I'm trying to also push is to have verifications that are written, so it's not a one requirement, one verification approach, because that's going to overwhelm the system. It's just not going to be workable due to scale. The question is going to be, how do we approach that?
All good activities.
We have another hand raised, Matthias.
Yeah, just so I can also just say or repeat what Mr. DeLamar said. Also in our industry, we're a little bit slow to the adoption of systems engineering. But at least now I can also see at some of our international bodies that systems engineering, and in particular requirements, is receiving some attention. I'm hopeful for the future that we can also see, at least for our input from these international bodies, that their requirements will receive a little bit of attention, because they're a little bit behind the ball in the way how these codes and standards, which is applicable for us, is structured and formulated. That's one topic. Second topic, to answer your question that you posed, Mr. Scatz, about if you get a requirement from one of these standards, if you can just copy and paste it, if it's suitable and it meets your quality criteria, that can be done. But one thing we should remember always is one of the reasons why I do your requirements analysis is also to pull straight the terminology that is used. Because the moment that you work with different bodies or with different organizations, input data through which you need to do the assessment of the needs, you have an opportunity to pull straight and to write your intended requirement or your system of interest requirement according to a vocabulary. And that's also one thing that I see working on many different projects, is the terminology that is used between these different standard organizations is for the same type of thing or for the same type of technical topic. They are using different terminology for it.
Fair
which is
enough. And I
also
think Lou mentioned sometimes we do library of requirements where we might upgrade them to our own terminology, but then reuse them as appropriate. But you have a very fair point there.
Thank you.
Quick comment. In the Yammer discussions, there was a comment that while the customers expect compliance to a class of standards, they always don't want to pay for it. And also, if the customer doesn't include key standards in the contract, there's an issue where the supplier is going to bid the effort it takes to meet those standards anyway. Because the customer didn't require it formally in the contract, how does the supplier deal with that? And one overall problem that I've seen, and why I've emphasized verification validation in the presentation, is that a lot of projects, especially government projects, don't bid accurately the cost and time it's going to take to adequately complete verification validation and manage all the artifacts and put together all the approval packages. And that could take maybe 50% of your development cost for new projects. It's kind of a pink elephant in the room is, do customers really want to pay for what they're expecting of the suppliers? And how do suppliers deal with that?
Which is related to costing of effort, verification effort. We think of the costing of design effort and construction effort, but not often the cost of verification and compliance.
Exactly. There's another issue in that diagram I showed that showed verification, validation, and context across the life cycle. We also introduced post-production verification and post-production validation. So once our products are out in the street, do they continue to be compliant with the standards and regulations over time? Especially if even after it's released, the standards and regulations change.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording